The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip behind the rows of trees, painting the deserted highway in a fiery orange hue. A sleek black Lamborghini Huracán glided smoothly down the road, its engine humming like a predator on the prowl. The man behind the wheel maintained a steady speed, neither too fast nor too slow, as if he had nowhere urgent to be. The wind rushed through the open window, carrying the scent of the countryside, a stark contrast to the suffocating air of the city. Suddenly, flashing red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror, accompanied by the blaring wail of a police siren. The tranquil atmosphere shattered. The man furrowed his brows slightly but remained composed as he guided his vehicle toward the shoulder, pulling over smoothly. He had done nothing wrong. So why was he being stopped? The side mirror reflected a tall, broad-shouldered white police officer, his uniform crisply ironed. He stepped out of his patrol car, his hand resting on his belt where his gun and baton were holstered. His posture suggested he was gearing up for an encounter. Approaching the Lamborghini, the officer rapped his knuckles on the window. The man pressed the button to lower it, his face calm and unreadable. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" he asked, his deep voice steady and unshaken. The officer stared at him for a long moment before answering, his tone clipped and devoid of courtesy. "License and registration." "Now." The man narrowed his eyes slightly but complied, reaching into the glove compartment to retrieve his documents. He handed them over, watching as the officer took them without so much as a glance, instead scanning the luxurious car's interior with suspicion. "A car like this?" The officer's voice dripped with skepticism. "Where'd you get it?" The man gave a small, humorless smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "I don't believe that's a standard question during a routine traffic stop, officer." The officer scoffed, his gaze darkening. "Answer me. Did you steal this car? Or did you buy it in some shady back alley deal?" The smile vanished from the man's face. His eyes locked onto the officer's, cold and unwavering. "I don't see why I need to entertain baseless accusations." The officer took a step back, his fingers twitching near his holster. "You got a criminal record. This kind of car doesn't belong to someone like you." The tension thickened. The man's grip on the steering wheel tightened momentarily, but he exhaled slowly, reining in his frustration. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered this kind of treatment, the doubtful stares, the unspoken accusations, the assumptions made purely based on the color of his skin. "Your town?" "Ha!" the man repeated, his voice dropping to a lower register. "I wasn't aware there were restrictions on who could own certain vehicles." The officer's jaw tightened. He glanced down at the documents in his hand, but instead of verifying them properly, he shook his head dismissively. "I bet these are fake." The man exhaled through his nose. "Then check your system. It will confirm everything you need to know." The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked back to his patrol car and started entering the information into his onboard computer. The man remained seated, watching through the side mirror. The road was empty. No other cars in sight. If this escalated, there would be no witnesses. Minutes passed. When the officer finally stepped out of his vehicle again, his expression had darkened even further. He was clearly dissatisfied with what he had found, or, more accurately, hadn't found. "Step out of the car." The man raised a brow. "For what reason?" The officer's voice grew harsher. "Step out now, or I'll charge you with resisting an officer." "This time?" The man chuckled, softly. But there was no humor in it. You really want to go this far? The officer didn't answer. But his hand now hovered dangerously close to his firearm. With a resigned sigh, the man unbuckled his seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with an effortless confidence. His eyes never left the officer's face, assessing him with an unsettling calm. Turn around. Hands up. I need to check for weapons. The officer ordered. The man remained still. He neither complied nor protested. He simply stood there, silent, waiting. He wanted to see just how far this officer was willing to go. The silence stretched between them, thick and unyielding. The man stood still, his hands at his sides, his posture relaxed yet unshakable. The officer, on the other hand, was anything but calm. His fingers twitched near his holster, his expression tight with frustration. This was not the reaction he had expected. I said, turn around. The officer repeated, his voice edged with impatience. Hands where I can see them. The man exhaled slowly, his gaze unwavering. Then, without a word, he lifted his hands and turned his back to the officer, moving deliberately, as if to prove he had nothing to hide. The officer stepped forward, patting him down roughly, his movements more forceful than necessary. He found nothing, no weapon, no contraband, nothing to justify his hostility. That only seemed to agitate him further. Spread your legs. The officer ordered, his voice now carrying an unmistakable edge. The man hesitated for a fraction of a second, then complied. The search continued. More invasive this time. More like a performance than an actual procedure. A display of power. A test of dominance. The officer finished his search and stepped back, frustrated by his lack of findings. He clenched his jaw. Whose car is this? I already gave you my registration. The man replied, his voice calm but firm. Yeah. And I'm not convinced it's real. The man turned slightly, just enough to meet the officer's gaze over his shoulder. Then run it again? The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. His eyes darted back to the Lamborghini, as if looking at it would somehow give him the answers he wanted. But there were no answers. No justifications for his suspicions, only a truth he refused to accept. A crackling sound erupted from the officer's radio. Static. Then a voice. Dispatch to Unit 7. Need an update on that traffic stop. The officer reached for his radio but hesitated. His fingers tightened around the device as if debating whether to respond. Before he could say anything, another voice cut through the static. A different officer. His tone sharp with urgency. Unit 7. Be advised, run the registration again. It came back clean. But we've got another hit on the name. Repeat. Run the name? The man remained still. But he could sense the shift in the officer's stance. He could hear it in the breath the officer took, in the slight rustle of his uniform as he shifted his weight. A pause. Then the officer muttered, "Shit." The man turned fully now, lowering his hands, watching the officer's expression change. He wasn't surprised. He had been waiting for this moment. Run it again. The officer's radio repeated. And confirm, this guy isn't just anyone. The silence that followed was deafening. The officer's face paled as the radio crackled again, demanding confirmation. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for his radio, hesitating before pressing the button. He cleared his throat, trying to mask the unease creeping into his voice. "Dispatch. This is Unit 7, he said. "What do you mean? He isn't just anyone." Silence. Then, a different voice came through the static. A voice of someone higher up the chain. "Unit 7. Stand by. We're sending someone to your location. Do not engage further." The officer's grip on the radio tightened. Sending someone. Who? Stand by. The transmission ended abruptly. The man had been watching him the entire time. His expression unreadable. His stance remained relaxed. As if he had all the time in the world. He knew. He had known all along how this would unfold. The officer swallowed hard. His mind racing. What had he just walked into? A few minutes passed. Stretching unbearably long in the heavy tension of the roadside. Then? The distant sound of tires on asphalt. The officer turned his head. Spotting a sleek, unmarked black SUV approaching at a controlled speed. It rolled to a stop just behind the patrol car. The door opened. And a man in a dark suit stepped out. The officer stiffened immediately. FBI. Secret Service. Who the hell was this guy? The suited man approached with measured steps. His gaze sharp. Assessing. Without glancing at the officer. He stopped in front of the man who had been pulled over. "Sir?" he greeted. His tone professional. Almost reverent. The officer blinked. "Sir?" The man finally moved. A small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Took you long enough," he said. The officer's stomach dropped. "Apologies. Sir? We had to confirm everything before intervening." The suited man replied. The officer's eyes darted between them. Confusion and growing dread swirling in his gut. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. His voice harsher than he intended. The suited man finally turned his attention to him. His expression unreadable. "Officer. You just detained someone you had no business detaining." The officer clenched his jaw. He was driving a high-end car that didn't seem to match. The suited man cut him off. "Did you verify his identity properly?" The officer opened his mouth. Then closed it. He had been so sure. So convinced that he didn't need to. He had let his bias speak louder than protocol. The suited man exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly before returning his focus to the man in question. "We should get going. There are people waiting for you." The man gave a slow nod before finally shifting his gaze back to the officer. He didn't say anything. Didn't have to. Everything the officer needed to know was already written in the look he gave him: disappointment. Perhaps. But not surprise. Without another word, the man turned and walked toward the black SUV. The suited man followed, pausing only to give the officer one last assessing glance before getting in. The vehicle's engine rumbled to life. Then it pulled away, disappearing down the road. The officer stood frozen, the weight of his actions settling on his chest like a lead block. His radio crackled to life again. But he barely heard it. He had just made the worst mistake of his career. The officer stood motionless, staring at the empty stretch of road where the black SUV had disappeared. His heart pounded. His throat dry. The radio on his shoulder crackled again. But he barely registered the sound. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his belt, as if grounding himself in something familiar. "Unit 7. Respond? What is your status?" The voice on the other end was impatient now. Swallowing hard, he lifted the radio. "This is Unit 7. The subject has left the scene, he said. His voice devoid of its earlier authority. A pause. Then? Return to the station immediately. We need to debrief. The officer exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around the radio before he clipped it back onto his belt. His mind was racing. Who was that man? What had he just done? And, more importantly, what would the consequences be? As he turned back toward his patrol car, he caught sight of his reflection in the side window, his own eyes filled with something he didn't want to name. Regret. Fear? Shame. Meanwhile, inside the black SUV, the man sat calmly in the back seat, gazing out the window as the trees blurred past. The suited man beside him glanced his way. That could have gone worse. The man chuckled, softly. It went exactly as expected. The suited man shook his head. You could have revealed your identity sooner. Saved yourself the hassle. The man turned slightly, his expression unreadable. And let him off easy. No. He needed to feel it. To understand? The SUV continued down the road, heading toward an unknown destination. But one thing was certain, this was far from over. Back at the station, the officer sat in the briefing room, the fluorescent lights casting an unforgiving glow over the paperwork in front of him. His superior, a grizzled man with sharp eyes, leaned against the table, arms crossed. You really messed up today, the superior said, his voice low but firm. The officer swallowed. I didn't know who he was. His superior scoffed. And that's the problem. You didn't even try to find out before treating him like a suspect. Now we have a mess to clean up. The officer clenched his fists under the table. Who is he? He finally asked. The superior sighed, rubbing a hand over his face before leveling the officer with a hard stare. He's not just some rich guy in a nice car. The door opened before he could finish, and another high-ranking official stepped inside. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. We have orders from above. This incident is to be handled quietly. No press. No leaks. The official said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The officer felt a cold pit form in his stomach. He knew then, this was bigger than he could have ever imagined. And his career might never recover from it. The next morning, Officer Daniels sat at his desk, staring blankly at the stack of reports in front of him. His name had been called into the captain's office twice already, but he hadn't moved. His mind was still replaying the events from the previous night. A sharp knock at his cubicle jolted him back. He looked up to see Officer Lewis, one of his colleagues, standing with arms crossed. They're waiting for you, Lewis said, voice laced with warning. And trust me, you don't want to keep them waiting. Daniels swallowed hard and rose to his feet. The walk to the captain's office felt longer than usual, each step heavier with uncertainty. When he entered, he saw Captain Reynolds standing beside the high-ranking official from the night before. Another man in a dark suit stood next to them, his expression unreadable. Sit down, Reynolds instructed. Daniels obeyed, keeping his posture stiff. The man in the suit spoke first. You made a critical error yesterday, Officer Daniels. A mistake that has put this department in an uncomfortable position. Daniels nodded but said nothing. The man continued. Do you have any idea who you stopped? Daniels licked his lips. I don't know exactly, but I know it was someone important. The suited man exchanged a glance with Reynolds before leaning forward. The man you detained was David Calloway. Former military. Billionaire entrepreneur. Philanthropist. And, as of 3 months ago, an unofficial consultant to the federal government on high-level security matters. Daniel's stomach dropped. "You see the problem now?" Reynolds asked. His voice edged with frustration. "You pulled over a man with federal clearance. Harassed him? And nearly caused a public relations disaster." Daniels clenched his jaw. I didn't know." "That's not an excuse," the suited man said sharply. "A routine check is one thing. But detaining him the way you did, accusing him of stealing his own car, that crosses a line." Daniels felt the weight of their words crushing down on him. He wanted to protest, to explain that he had only been doing his job, but deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He had let his assumptions dictate his actions. Reynolds exhaled heavily. "We have two choices. We can try to sweep this under the rug. Hope Calloway doesn't take this to the press. Or..." Daniels looked up. "Or what?" The suited man's eyes narrowed. "Or you take responsibility. Apologize. Publicly. If necessary. And you go through extensive retraining on racial profiling and de-escalation." Daniel's pride flared. But he bit it down. "And if I refuse?" Reynolds folded his arms. "Then you're done here." A heavy silence filled the room. Daniels let out a slow breath. He had spent years in this department. It was his career. His life. But now, he was faced with a choice that could determine everything. Finally, he nodded. "I'll do it." The suited man studied him for a long moment before giving a single nod. "Then let's get started." Daniels felt the gravity of the moment settle in. This wasn't just about his career anymore. It was about the truth he had been forced to confront. The next morning, Officer Daniels sat at his desk, staring blankly at the stack of reports in front of him. His name had been called into the captain's office twice already. But he hadn't moved. His mind was still replaying the events from the previous night. A sharp knock at his cubicle jolted him back. He looked up to see Officer Lewis, one of his colleagues, standing with arms crossed. "They're waiting for you," Lewis said, voice laced with warning. "And trust me, you don't want to keep them waiting." Daniels swallowed hard and rose to his feet. The walk to the captain's office felt longer than usual, each step heavier with uncertainty. When he entered, he saw Captain Reynolds standing beside the high-ranking official from the night before. Another man in a dark suit stood next to them, his expression unreadable. "Sit down," Reynolds instructed. Daniels obeyed, keeping his posture stiff. The man in the suit spoke first. "You made a critical error yesterday, Officer Daniels. A mistake that has put this department in an uncomfortable position." Daniels nodded but said nothing. The man continued. "Do you have any idea who you stopped?" Daniels licked his lips. "I don't know exactly. But I know it was someone important." The suited man exchanged a glance with Reynolds before leaning forward. "The man you detained was David Calloway. Former military. Billionaire entrepreneur. Philanthropist. And, as of 3 months ago, an unofficial consultant to the federal government on high-level security matters." Daniels' stomach dropped. "You see the problem now?" Reynolds asked. His voice edged with frustration. "You pulled over a man with federal clearance. Harassed him? And nearly caused a public relations disaster." Daniels clenched his jaw. I didn't know. That's not an excuse, the suited man said sharply. A routine check is one thing. But detaining him the way you did, accusing him of stealing his own car, that crosses a line. Daniels felt the weight of their words crushing down on him. He wanted to protest, to explain that he had only been doing his job, but deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He had let his assumptions dictate his actions. Reynolds exhaled heavily. We have two choices. We can try to sweep this under the rug. Hope Calloway doesn't take this to the press. Or. Daniels looked up. Or what? The suited man's eyes narrowed. Or you take responsibility. Apologize. Publicly. If necessary. And you go through extensive retraining on racial profiling and de-escalation. Daniels' pride flared. But he bit it down. And if I refuse? Reynolds folded his arms. Then you're done here. A heavy silence filled the room. Daniels let out a slow breath. He had spent years in this department. It was his career. His life. But now, he was faced with a choice that could determine everything. Finally, he nodded. I'll do it. The suited man studied him for a long moment before giving a single nod. Then let's get started. Daniels felt the gravity of the moment settle in. This wasn't just about his career anymore. It was about the truth he had been forced to confront. Later that evening, as Daniels sat in his car outside the station, he pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen before he finally searched for David Calloway's name. Articles, interviews, and philanthropic efforts filled his screen. The more he read, the more his stomach twisted. This was a man who had spent his life helping others, fighting for justice. And yet, Daniels had treated him like a criminal simply because of his own biases. He let out a long, tired sigh. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Daniels sat in his patrol car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The past few weeks had changed him in ways he never expected. He had spent years enforcing the law, believing he was doing the right thing. But now, for the first time, he felt like the one under scrutiny. He inhaled deeply before stepping out of his car. The small community center ahead of him was nothing remarkable, just a simple brick building with a worn-out sign. But for Daniels, it represented something much bigger. Inside, people gathered to discuss racial profiling and police bias. And tonight, he was expected to speak. As he entered, he saw David Calloway standing at the front of the room, addressing the audience. The man who had once stood silently during Daniels' accusations now spoke with unwavering confidence. Racism doesn't always come in obvious forms, Calloway said. It's in the way people cross the street when they see someone who looks like me. It's in the assumptions made before a word is even spoken. Daniels took a seat near the back, feeling the weight of Calloway's words settle over him. When Calloway finally turned his attention to him, the room went silent. Officer Daniels, Calloway said, his voice calm but firm. Would you like to share your thoughts? Daniels hesitated, then stood. His uniform, once a symbol of authority, felt heavy on his shoulders. I used to think I was a good cop, he began. That night, I saw a black man in a luxury car and assumed the worst. I didn't ask questions. I didn't stop to consider any other possibility. I reacted based on my bias. A murmur spread through the room. Daniels forced himself to continue. I was wrong. And I'm here because I want to be better. Not just for my career, but for the people I serve. Calloway studied him for a moment before nodding. Acknowledging the problem is the first step. But change takes time. Daniels exhaled, feeling the weight in his chest ease slightly. He was ready to do the work. Over the following weeks, Daniels attended every session at the center. He listened to stories from people who had been unfairly targeted by the police, learning about the fear and frustration they lived with daily. He heard from parents who had to teach their children how to survive encounters with law enforcement. One evening, after an emotional discussion, he lingered as the room emptied. Calloway was gathering his notes when he looked up. "Something on your mind?" Daniels stepped forward. "I just wanted to say, I appreciate this. Everything you're doing." Calloway gave him a knowing smile. "It's not about me. It's about all of us." Daniels hesitated before saying, "I'm sorry for what happened that night." Calloway studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. "Apology accepted. But like I said, change takes time. Keep doing the work." Daniels shook his hand, knowing this was just the beginning. Months later, he found himself in a familiar situation, a traffic stop. A young black man sat behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel, his breathing shallow. Daniels approached the car slowly, offering a reassuring nod. "Good evening, sir. Just a routine check. Can I see your license and registration?" The young man hesitated, clearly expecting the worst. Daniels softened his tone. "You're not in trouble. Take your time." The tension in the air eased slightly. The young man handed over his documents, and after a brief check, Daniels returned them with a small smile. "Everything looks good. Drive safe." As he walked back to his patrol car, he saw the look of cautious relief on the young man's face. And for the first time, Daniels knew he was truly making a difference. How do you feel about this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your feedback to improve even more. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our latest videos. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.